Correct. So thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you all for coming to this presentation. My name is Kostas Drakonakis, and I'll be presenting our work titled "Please Forget Where I Was Last Summer: The Privacy Risks of Public Location Metadata." This was a co-joint work between Fort Greece and the University of Illinois at Chicago, and was conducted in collaboration with Panagiotis, Ilia, Sotiris, Ioannidis, and Jason Polakis. So to begin with, we are all well aware that modern devices such as our smartphones, wearable devices, and so on, generally have the ability to collect fine-grained location information. That is our device's precise GPS coordinates, which further enables a wide range of novel functionality, generally aiming to enrich user experience. However, from a privacy perspective, such fine-grained location information can pose obviously significant threat to users. For instance, the inference of a user's key locations, namely their home and work locations, can lead to de-anonymization as well as a wide range of physical threats such as stalking. In addition to that, other location points can generally lead to the inference of very sensitive user information such as possible medical issues. So what do we know on this area so far? There have been multiple prior studies that explore the problem of key location inference, but they all come with a quite important limitation. Specifically, they perform their inference at a very coarse granularity, usually at the postcode level, or zip code level for the US, or even greater than that. And thus, they do not truly manage to highlight the true extent of the privacy risks that users face due to the availability of such fine-grained location metadata. In addition to that, the inference of sensitive user information in an automated manner, while it has been extensively used as a motivation in other location privacy-related studies, has not yet been explored. So in this work, we explore those two issues, and more specifically, we perform and present a case study on Twitter. So we consider tweets that contain GPS coordinates embedded in their metadata, or more commonly known as geotag tweets. However, there have been some recent quite revealing news reports that show there are also other sources for such fine-grained location information, such major telecom companies here in the US that were collecting and selling such information from their users for years. So moving onwards, a few words about our dataset collection. We use Twitter's public streaming API in order to collect a set of seed user IDs, for which we then proceeded from the mainland of the United States, for which we then proceeded to collect their timelines, and more specifically, the 3,200 most recent tweets according to Twitter's policy. Now, after considering only the geotag tweets that are of interest to us, generated by one of the official Twitter mobile applications, or the Foursquare mobile app, for which we know how they operate and handle location metadata, we end up with approximately 87,000 users with geotagging activity and 15 million geotag tweets. We then further break down our dataset into two smaller subsets, namely the top 6K dataset, consisting of approximately the 6,000 users with the most geotag tweets, and the low 10K dataset having almost 10,000 users, randomly selected users, with 10 to 250 geotag tweets. This breakdown was necessary due to rate limits imposed by the different APIs we use throughout our study, as we will see next. But it also allows us to study the differences between both prolific and restrained users in regards to their geotagging activity. So now a little bit of preliminary methodology. Before trying to infer anything about anyone, we first need to geographically cluster together a user's location points. So in our case study, they're geotag tweets. So to that end, we employ our first level clustering, where we use the ArcGIS geocoding API in order to assign an actual postal address to each pair of coordinates. And then obviously the tweets that were mapped to the same postal address form a single first level cluster. However, we empirically observed that it is quite common that sometimes nearby first level clusters might actually correspond to the same user location. And this can happen due to a variety of reasons, such as inaccuracy at the GPS readings of the user's device, or even the user leaving or arriving at that location when posting their tweet. So in order to address this and to better capture the user behavior from that specific location, which is of great importance in our case, we employ our second level clustering, where we use the dbScan clustering algorithm so as to merge those first level nearby clusters into a single location cluster, as we saw also in this example figure. Now moving on, in order to be able to accurately evaluate our techniques, we also need to generate as accurate as possible ground truth datasets. So to achieve this, we had two independent annotators perform a manual and strict workflow where we begin by matching certain key phrases, such as I'm home, arrived home, and so on, against the cluster's contents. And then the annotators inspected the clusters that matched one of those key phrases, as well as the 10 largest clusters of the user at hand. Now it's important to note at this point that the slightest disagreement between the annotators when comparing their assigned labels led to discarding the user in question entirely from our ground truth. So at the end of this process, we end up having the home top and home low ground truth datasets derived from the two main datasets we introduced earlier. It's having approximately 1,000 users. Also, in order to generate our work location ground truth, we performed the exact same process on the generated home ground truth, but this time using work-related key phrases. And we end up having the work top and work low work location ground truth datasets having approximately 392 users respectively. So now moving on to our actual key location inference techniques, we begin by introducing some basic design decisions that dictate them. First of all, they operate solely on spatiotemporal metadata. That is, they only need a pair of coordinates and a timestamp to work. So they're not dependent on other features such as user social graphs or the tweet's content. And second, they're guided entirely by common societal and legislative norms here in the US and the EU, such as 8-hour work shifts. Next, we provide a higher level intuitive overview of our techniques. You can find, of course, much more detailed descriptions in the paper. So more specifically, our home location inference technique relies on two behavioral characteristics that we commonly expect to observe from a user's home location. And in order to better get a better idea of these characteristics and what we try to capture, we plot the activity from the home location for two example users from our ground truth. So on the x-axis, we have the different days of the home location cluster and weeks, and the y-axis, we have the different hours of posting tweets. So the first characteristic is that we expect to see some repeated activity in the long term, and secondly, that we do not expect to see a well-defined time frame of activity. So in other words, we expect to see a more chaotic behavior in terms of different hours of posting tweets from a user's home location. Now our technique operates as follows. We select the 5 most active clusters in terms of active weekends, so weekends with at least one geotag tweet, and then out of those, we simply pick the one with the broadest time frame, so the one exhibiting this more chaotic behavior. Now, for the work location inference, again, relies on two specific characteristics. We plot the work location activity for the same users with the green points this time. Again, we do expect to see some repeated activity, but in contrast to the home location, we actually do expect to see a well-defined time frame of activity corresponding to the user's working hours. So our technique operates as follows. We select the 5 most active clusters in terms of entire weeks this time, and then we proceed to dynamically identify the dominant time frame for each of those clusters. Or in other words, we try to identify the most prominent hours of activity from each specific cluster. And finally, we pick the most active cluster in terms of entire weeks, but also considering its cluster's dominant time frame. It's also worth noting that our system can correctly identify both a home and work location for both of these example users that also exhibit different characteristics. So when evaluating our techniques on our generated ground truth dataset, we observed that for the home inference, our system achieves a precision of approximately 92.5%, while for the work inference, it achieves a precision of approximately 56% on average among the two ground truth datasets. As we mentioned, there have been also multiple other studies that explore the same problem, so naturally we wanted to compare our techniques to theirs. And instead of comparing to the reported numbers, which would be quite inaccurate since we have different data sets, different clustering methods, and so on, we actually opted to replicate, that is to implement 11 prior approaches for inferring home locations and another 2 for inferring work locations. We applied our first level clustering on those, and we ran them on our ground truth so as to be able to conduct this direct comparison. So while we detail this much more in the paper, the important takeaway point is that our system outperforms all prior approaches. More specifically, for the home inference, we present an improvement of, in the worst case scenario, almost 19%, and for the work location, 8.7% improvement in our precision. So moving on, besides from a user's key locations, other location points can be of significance privacy-wise as well. So we were curious as to what else can we infer about a user from the remaining of their location history. So what we try to do here is that we try to identify highly sensitive places that the users have visited. We begin by identifying what we call potentially sensitive clusters, which are clusters in close proximity to sensitive venues. And the venue information we collect using the Foursquare API, where we submit the cluster's geographical midpoint and consider the venues that lie within 25 meters from the midpoint, and also that their specific Foursquare category pertains to one of the more generic categories of health, religion, and sexual nightlife. However, it's apparent that just because a user was nearby a sensitive venue, it does not necessarily mean that they were actually visiting that sensitive venue. So we need methods to increase our confidence. So we proposed two methods. The first one was what we call content-based corroboration, where we manually compile the word list for each of the three main categories we mentioned by using a plethora of online domain-specific corpora. And then we proceeded to use TF-IDF to extract the three most significant terms for each potentially sensitive cluster. Now, if any of those significant terms match the corresponding word list, we have high confidence that the user was actually visiting that sensitive venue. Now, it's important to note at this point that while the user might disclose something relevant, the keyword in our case, about being at that venue, it does not necessarily mean that there was no privacy leakage. On the contrary, we empirically observed that it is quite common in our datasets that users might express something quite generic and not extremely sensitive, such as waiting at their doctor's office for too long. However, we managed to place a lot of these users at very sensitive locations, such as rehab centers, mental health institutions, abortion clinics, and so on. So it becomes clear that the privacy loss that these users face is significantly magnified by the enriched context offered by this location metadata. Now, moving on to our second approach into increasing our confidence, it's called duration-based corroboration, and as the name suggests, it relies on the duration and repetitiveness of user visits at a single location cluster. So for this technique, we consider clusters that have an activity spanning several hours or even different days, and also exclude clusters that have an activity of less than 5 minutes, so as to avoid cases that the user was most likely a passerby. Now, moving on, before going to the evaluation of our techniques, we first break down the potentially sensitive clusters we identify in our home ground truth datasets. We have approximately 6,500 PSCs, potentially sensitive clusters. Around 5,000 of them, the vast majority, belong to the general medical health-related category. We can see it with the green bars on the plot, and also the specific Foursquare categories on the bottom. Around 900 of them are religious-based, and only 471 are related to sexual nightlife, with the red bars in the end. So to the evaluation of our techniques, out of those 6,500 potentially sensitive clusters, the content-based corroboration detects 545 out of them as actually sensitive. We manually verify this by inspecting all clusters that contain the word list term, irrespectively of if they were detected by our system or not, and we end up achieving a precision of approximately 80% and a recall of 94%. Now, for the duration-based corroboration, while we established something we didn't establish yet, is that this technique has certain limitations. First of all, it lacks confidence. The user might as well be at the nearby sensitive venue, the nearby venue, not at the sensitive one. And also, it cannot operate on clusters with a single tweet, since we don't have any information about the visit's duration. So yes, while this technique comes with certain limitation, an interesting observation is that around 53% for the home top dataset and 44% for the home low of the clusters that were detected by the content-based corroboration were also detected by the duration-based approach. So if an attacker has requirements for higher levels of confidence into placing the user at sensitive location, both of these techniques can be combined. Now, moving on, another interesting finding we had during the course of our work is a kind of strange behavior we observed where, during our analysis, where we saw that older tweets were always accompanied by precise location information, even though users tagged them only with a coarse-grained location label, while more recent tweets could only have the coarse-grained location label without any precise GPS coordinates. So after further analysis, we identified Twitter's policy change on location information, and exactly what's happening is that before April 2015, truly users could tag tweets with only coarse-grained location label, but the mobile apps, Twitter mobile apps, would also embed precise GPS coordinates. And to make matters worse, these GPS coordinates were only accessible via the API and not visible to the users via any other means. So they were most likely oblivious to this happening at all. Since April 2015, Twitter opted for a more privacy-respecting policy, where users have to opt in on a per-tweet basis to embed such precise location information. However, this sensitive historical metadata remains publicly accessible to this day via Twitter's API. So in order to get a better understanding into how user behavior changed through time in regards to their geotagging activity, in this figure we see the total number of geotagged tweets from our entire dataset and throughout time on the x-axis in 4-month buckets, And what we observe is that right after April 2015, that the more privacy-respecting app versions came out, there is a massive reduction in the number of geotag tweets, specifically a 35-fold reduction, which further signifies that when users are given the choice, they are way more restrained when it comes to publishing their exact location. Now, we also wanted to see how the availability of this historical metadata impacts users. So to achieve this, what we did is that we rerun our home inference technique or our home ground truth, but this time considering the geotag tweets of the users that were posted from the release date of the newer app versions and afterwards, and also 4 weeks after the release date and onwards, so as to be more certain that more users had updated their applications to the newer versions. And while the precision of our system naturally drops since we have much fewer geotag tweets, another interesting observation is the coverage that our system achieves. So more practically, considering the +4 weeks results for the home top dataset, we observe that our system can correctly identify the home location for 7.34% that we were initially able to correctly identify their home when considering their entire timeline snapshot, including this precise location information. So it's apparent that the availability of this sensitive historical metadata impacts a large amount of users in a quite significant way. So really quick, we have designed a system that implements our approaches, and while we called LP Auditor, and while we implemented to test our approach and measure them, it could be as well adopted by service as a tool towards their users to control what they expose and what can be inferred about them. We believe that we do highlight the true extent of the privacy risks that users face due to the availability of such data. And finally, we believe that we have provided, that we have revealed and shed light on Twitter's past invasive policy on location metadata and how it impacted and still impacts users to this day. So thank you very much for your time. I'd be happy to take any of your questions.
I'm Chan from University of South Carolina. Maybe I have missed something, but could you elaborate a little bit more why clustering can help improve the precision? Another question is that...
Sorry, I didn't catch it.
Why clustering? You proposed the idea of clustering, right?
Yes, yes. Correct.
Why it helps improve the precision? Maybe I missed that part. And the second question is, do you think you get a cluster of the user's data, whether that is a practical assumption or not?
Okay, so for the first question, if I get that correctly, is how our clustering impacts our precision.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. So we actually did measure this. We ran our inference techniques by applying only our first level clustering. And we still outperform all prior approaches, but by a much smaller percentage. Specifically by around 1% for the home inference, and actually for the work inference we fall behind by 1%. So especially our second level clustering plays an important role into the goal that we actually try to achieve by implementing that and designing that we better capture the user behavior from those specific locations, so the behavioral characteristics we mentioned. So yes, the second level clustering is an important enhancement into capturing what we try to do. And about the second question?
The second question is that whether it's a good assumption or practical assumption to assume that you can get a cluster of a large amount of data of a user.
From one user?
Yeah.
Yes, there are users that don't have, that's why we consider also users with as few as 10 geotag tweets. So obviously those users have less clusters, well, depending how they're split up, the tweets in those clusters. But it's still practical. It's user's location, and we still try to capture those characteristics. It's not always the case, but according to our precision, we do capture them.